Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project. We're very happy to have back with us for a second week the Yale Working Group on Globalization and Culture. They have presented a number of times at previous MEP events in previous years, and we look forward to having them back on a recurring basis. So right now I'd just like to turn it over to Sophia from the Working Group, who will chair the panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I just want to apologize in advance for some of the noise in the background. I'm outside. I just finished a canvas for Zohran Mamdani, so it's for a good cause, but I'll start us off. So we are the Working Group on Globalization and Culture, an interdisciplinary cultural studies laboratory that has been practicing collective research at Yale for 2 decades. Our methods are a bit unorthodox. Bringing together scholars from a variety of fields, we select a keyword for the academic year, usually prompted by the figures and slogans of our social movements. And we pick this word as a thread to connect our research across periods and regions, practices, and knowledges. Some of us will make arguments about the insights and oversights of the keyword. Others will adapt the keyword to their own lenses and ways of seeing. Can I get a slide, please? Quote, "It's not news that Trump is a creature of the society of spectacle," unquote. T.J. Clark wrote in January in his brief guide to Trump and the spectacle in the London Review of Books. "Define the society of spectacle," he joked. Quote, "Oh, come on, you know what it is. What do you want? A Helen Levitt street scene opposite a drone shot of children looking at their iPhones," unquote. Clark's dilemma is ours. Can one think new thoughts about the spectacle? After all, he continues, quote, "Those who first thought seriously about the society of the spectacle did not imagine it could last. They wrote in a time of upheaval, believing the world had already grown tired of its reflection," unquote. In retrospect, an oversight. So we return to the specter of the spectacle. Does this lens still enable us to make sense of shared sensorial flashpoints, past and present? What does it mean to be a spectator, to look, to witness, to oversee? In 2 linked panels, we hope to track the worldwide division of spectacular tasks. This second panel today, called Witness, asks how those subject to exploitation, oppression, and state violence are represented through spectacle or represent themselves through a counter-spectacle. We'll hear about spectacles of sympathy in Morgan's account of American human interest stories about Inuit in the age of American polar exploration. Michael will analyze the spectacle of mass demonstration, a new social form undertaken by the rise of an urban proletariat struggling to represent itself in the 19th century. Then Damanpreet will take us to post-colonial India to challenge the predominant depoliticized media representations of Sikh rebels challenging the violence of the state. Henry will analyze literary representations of student protests in Tiananmen Square. And Madeline will close us out with the organizers memorializing the Korean camptown women subject to US military's ongoing occupation of Korea. Each of us will talk for about 15 minutes. And finally, as this is a single collective presentation, we ask that you save your responses and questions for the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. I will go ahead and get us started. Javier, thank you. In 1897, upon returning from one of his earlier Arctic expeditions in search of the North Pole, American explorer Robert Peary brought with him 6 Inuit from the settlement of Etah at behest of the anthropologist Franz Boas, whom he had met and worked with during his travels northward. Boas had in fact requested, quote, a middle-aged Danuk to stay at the American Museum of Natural History over the winter, but instead was delivered Oktangana, Nuktak, Aviak, Usakosak, Kisik, and his 6-year-old son Minik, who were all subsequently held and studied in the basement of the institution in New York City. Shortly thereafter, 4 died after contracting tuberculosis, prompting Usokusuk to return home and leaving Minnick the sole remaining member of the original party. The life of the newly orphaned child proceeded to be chronicled over the next 3 decades in the pages of popular and local American and international newspapers. Despite the fact that by this point, Boas had publicly theorized his idea of cultural relativism, these spectacular and sympathetic human interest stories remained imbued with the cruel manifestations of social evolution. The death of Minnick's father catapulted the child into a haunted chronicle of Arctic exploration in the long 20th century. Slide, please. Jane McCorstein's Spectral Arctic, A History of Dreams and Ghosts in Polar Exploration, theorizes the titular phrase, Spectral Arctic, as describing the unique unidirectional relation between the West and the Arctic, namely as it was established through 19th century British exploration in search of a Northwest Passage. The book centers the role of the spectral, meaning expressions of the ghostly, psychic, or spiritual, in British literature, print, and visual culture, especially as it was produced in response to the Lost Franklin expedition of 1845. It demonstrates the ways that this impulse extends to the present moment. In my part of the presentation, I take up McCorstein's Spectral Arctic in an American context, using this framework to describe how the upper-class members of the public in the early 20th century accessed this geography. McCorstein poses that, quote, 19th century audiences saw the Arctic as a dreamlike zone that overflowed the cartographic and literary space in which it was traditionally bounded by the tiny group of men who promoted and handled polar exploration. Because of the spectral power of the Arctic as an idea, it could be sensed remotely, dreamed about, and imagined and consumed by the people who were at a great distance from the Arctic geographically and politically. It is this overflow and remote consumption of Minnick and his life that I'm interested in tracing through newsprint. As a child, he's described as possessing a spectacular intellect, whose occasional anecdotes from the homeland are a source of entertainment. In his early adult years, Minnick's subjecthood transforms as he begins to speak directly to journalists regarding his hopes and motivations, a brief insight into his inner world. Ultimately, this platform was brief, circling back to a third-person narrative that obscures Minnick and prioritizes an altruistic story of goodwill and curiosity. Slide, please. An article from 1899 cites the cause of death of Minnick's 4 companions as climatic change, while staking claim that the child possessed exceptional health and a disposition that aided his survival. The boy had, by this point, been adopted by Chief Curator William Wallace, who reveled in the opportunity to educate Minnick alongside his own son. This curious fairy tale, as it was labeled in the Atchison Globe of Kansas, of course, still relegated the boy to specimen, though now living outside the confines of the Natural History Museum. Initially, the press widely syndicated reports on Minnick's aptitude for the English language, as well as his persistent but sometimes fleeting memory of his mother tongue. Slide, please. Retta Wallace, wife of William Wallace, was said to have been quick to intervene at any recollection of Inuit epistemologies that interfered with his religious education. His insistence on the afterlife, for example, in which he would find his ancestors at the seabed where, quote, the hunting and fishing were very good, was met with the refusal and immediate redirection by the Guardian couple, according to the New York Tribune. He is an experiment and a promising one in the effects of civilization upon the least known Aboriginal races, the story concludes. Here in this slide are 2 stories run by the New York Tribune 2 years apart, monitoring the status of the child's development. In the photograph on the right, Minnick is pictured with another child, a 9-year-old Alaska Native girl named Zexriner. Both are posed alongside their American foster mothers, each of whom have a paternal arm around their respective child. The reporter describes a scene in which Minnick and Zexriner are instructed impromptu to count and sing in their native languages, which was, quote, done evidently under a strain to the feeling of the 2 children. A crowd of, quote, everyday New York children became greatly excited by Minnick's recall of adventure on the ice fields, as was encouraged by Mrs. Wallace in this impromptu performance, which subsequently brings this seance, as the reporter writes, to an end. In this moment, it's apparent that the audience, or at the very least the reporter, in his words, is compelled by this other imagined place via their consumption of the two children, as if their very aliveness simultaneously renders them vessels through which ghosts can speak, if not specters themselves. The conflicting excitement and hesitance imbued in this encounter is a recital of the Gothic wilderness that McCorstein describes as enrapturing the British consumers of Arctic tales and triumph. Though stateside, it is the Inuk himself, not just the text, that is the portal. Slide, please. The following year, in 1901, the specter of Kisuk, Minnick's father, appears as the subject of the medical anthropological text An Eskimo Brain, written by Alice Hrdlicka. The book opens with a nude mugshot-like front and profile photographs of the father and son taken after their arrival to Bellevue Hospital in 1897. The remainder of the photographs are cerebral cross-sections of Kisuk's brain. Hrdlicka returns to Minnick in his conclusion with a reflection of the child's impressive assimilation, alluding to the desire to exercise the same violation on Minnick's body in the future. And here you can see, he concludes, the marked differences of the specimens described in this paper from those of the whites, as well as among themselves, make a future acquisition of the Eskimo brain very desirable. Next slide, please. Nearly a decade later, in 1909, public awe turned to sympathy once a widely syndicated report was published with the headlines, "Science Yearns for Youth's Death," and "Eskimo Says He Has Been Vivisected." Through this article, it became public knowledge that Kisuk had not been allowed the Inuit burial that his son had insisted upon at the time of his death, but was instead immediately dissected with his remains cataloged into the collection of the Museum of Natural History. The most sensational stories, and at times Minnick himself, write that he encountered his father's remains on display, though that the museum ever displayed Kisuk's remains is uncertain. What is certain, however, is that around this time, Minnick learns to interface with the papers, making emotional appeals to their readership. During this period, Minnick expresses his own motivations for reaching the pole, as well as the homesickness, memories of his native language, friends he has not forgotten, and most paramount, the grief of knowing his father's fate. The now 22-year-old was by this time aware for years of the scientific investment in his own death, the possibility of which was advertised through the papers when they ran the single sentence update, "Minnick, the Eskimo boy, is now suffering from pneumonia," just a year prior to this widely syndicated 1909 piece. As Avery Gordon tells us, being haunted has the potential to instigate a transformative recognition of the realities of modern life. Here, with the specters and spectacles of racial capitalism ensnared, Minnick is suffocated to the extent that he fears for his life and was at this point determined to return home. It was benefactors wealthier than the Wallace family that covered the child's initial living and schooling expenses. The millionaire William Ziegler had previously funded expeditions in search of the pole and had investments in Minnick's potential to be the one who completes that very mission. In 1904, the industrialist and, quote, a number of his millionaire friends publicly expressed that, quote, they hope he will find himself fit in the next 5 years to attempt to make the dash to the pole himself. And in fact, in 1909, we find ourselves 5 years later. But by the time Minnick insists on his repatriation, Ziegler had died and the spectacle of his youth had waned. The most popular male impersonator of the era, slide please, Vesta Tilley, was one of the only wealthy patrons to answer the call to either support this voyage or be responsible for Minnick's suicide, which he had threatened to journalists, who then relayed these stakes in the papers. Alongside the clipping headlined Vesta Tilley's Benevolence, I include an excerpt from the Daily Telegraph. Both of these are the same papers, but nearly a decade prior, wherein one of Tilley's performances appears advertised adjacent to an exhibition of, quote, a genuine Eskimo encampment and sledge dogs, denoting the cultural landscape of entertainment in which these two figures both occupied, though only one amassed a fortune from life on stage. I argue that the polar frontier is a sometimes periphery, other times central, but always ever-present Western mythology in the Barthesian sense, in which the process of navigating or fashioning a relationship to this geography supersedes the outcome. Minnick's fate, the eventual flag planting of True North, or a resolution to the American geopolitical relationship to Kulalleq or Greenland, are not the object of this mythology. Instead, this othered realm is a form which holds a series of spectacles that naturalize the idea of the Arctic as a sublime frontier, remaining always ripe for discovery. One story calls the desire foolish to be anxious to go back to a land where blubber and greasy fish are luxuries, despite this race to the pole reaching its peak at this very moment. Slide, please. Now a young man, Minnick is emboldened to communicate his anger towards Robert Perry via the press for abandoning him in the United States and bearing responsibility for the fate of his father. Ultimately, it was a threat to Perry's life that intimidated the explorer's associates to allow Minnick aboard a charter northward in 1909. This is where, obviously, the year where all of this is culminating. Minnick says, "I would shoot Mr. Perry and the museum director, only I want them to see how much more a savage Eskimo is than their enlightened white selves." Though his own words, in fact, refuted any real attempt to take Perry's life, Minnick was required to sign a contract stating that he would never carry arms in Greenland and never return to the United States in order to secure his passage on a relief ship sent to deliver supplies to Perry's camp. 2 years later, word reached New York that Minnick had been dropped by Perry's crew, approximately 150 miles south of his intended destination, Etah, without adequate transportation or provisions. Slide, please. The journey of Minnick Wallace's return home and the ways in which it was relayed to a wider audience reveals a split in sentiment between those funding the charge in the Arctic and the general public. Minnick garnered support for leading his own expedition northward, but only in the form of the occasional filler story, which served to entertain readers. Perry, instead, had created a web of dependence on goods that reached these remote regions for the purpose of supplying his own camps, but eventually filtered down into the hands of local populations. While journalists or the philanthropic celebrity imagined a scenario in which the American-educated Minnick repatriated, perhaps even to in turn locate the elusive True North, Robert Perry and his team knew that their control over the flow of capital into northern Greenland would never permit this to happen. Still, it was urgent to maintain the facade of a benevolent relationship between the Greenlandic Inuit aiding this search to secure financial support if future fundraising efforts were needed. These stakes were such that Minnick was made to sign a false receipt provisions, including a rifle and ammunition, in contradiction of the very parameters of his return, which he was equipped with at the generosity of Commander Perry, which was, of course, untrue. Early 20th century reporting on the fate of the original 6 Inuit changed over the years. It was often written that all 5, with the exception of Minnick, died, neglecting to mention Usakusak, who returned home after it became evident that his chances of survival in New York were slim. In a 1911 report, the origin story is recounted as Minnick, his father, and that's in this slide here, and just 2 others, effectively disappearing the remaining 2. The young Alaska Native girl, Zakswiner, who I mentioned earlier and was also studied by the Museum of Natural History, ceases to be mentioned in the papers after her appearance with Minnick, her world obscured and faded into newsprint. To conclude, the spectral Arctic is inextricable from the Arctic spectacle, wherein vanishment is a requisite of conjuring. This same dichotomy can be traced to the coverage of the remainder of Minnick's life, as well as in the lives of the Inuit descendants of American Arctic explorers, and in most recently, Trump's pursuit of Greenland as an American territory. Thank you for listening. And next we have Michael Denning, who will discuss the form of the mass demonstration as it pertains to ideas of suffrage.
Among the great spectacles of modern society is the mass demonstration. In the photograph, slide please, of the Chartist gathering on Kensington Common in South London in April of 1848, the new technology of the spectacle captured a new political form. But how do we understand the spectacle of the mass demonstration? Is it, as Charles Tilly famously argued, next slide, a new form of collective action invented by the social movement, one of a very limited range of claim-making performances, special purpose associations, public meetings, petition drives, street demonstrations? Or is it part of the repertoire of representative government itself, the basis of what we might call demonstration democracy, as citizens gather and march in dances that are partly choreographed and partly improvised? For it is still with us. Slide, please. By 2020, after street battles from Chile to Hong Kong, the journalist Vincent Bevins writes, the world had experienced more mass protest in the previous decade than at any other point in human history, exceeding the famous global cycle of contention in the 1960s. Drawing his statistics, next slide, from this study of mass protest. And Mark Biesinger, next slide please, argues that a new form of revolution carried out by mass demonstrations, largely nonviolent, in urban streets and squares, has emerged over the last half-century and changed the very meaning of revolution. Where does mass demonstration fit in a Marxist account of politics? In a curious oversight, there's little explicit discussion of Marx's own account of mass demonstration as a political form. In part, this might be a hangover from the defeats of 1848. For not only was the Chartist demonstration, pictured in that photograph, counted a failure, Marx himself was skeptical of the 48ers' vision of revolution as, next slide please, a mass gathering in the streets, a riot, a handclasp, and it's all over. In their view, indeed, revolution consists merely in the overthrow of the existing government. Once this aim has been achieved, the victory has been won. Movement, development, and struggle then cease. But Marx continued to witness and march in these mass demonstrations during his decades in London. From next slide, from the Hyde Park demonstrations against Sunday trading laws, to next slide, the painful spectacle witnessed by a part of the metropolis and inserted at the last minute in Capital, a demonstration by unemployed artisans and laborers in London's East End. To, next slide please, the great demonstrations he attended in support of amnesty for the imprisoned Irish Fenians. A new form with three distinct contexts: a protest by consumers, a march of the unemployed, and a defense of colonial prisoners. In this part of our presentation, I want to look briefly at Marx's account of two Hyde Park demonstrations, next slide please, in the summer of 1855, to see how Marx viewed the demonstration as a political form, as well as its place within his larger political theory, what he calls the religion of popular life. Next slide, please. We were spectators from beginning to end, he exulted in print, and believe we can state without exaggeration that yesterday in Hyde Park the English Revolution began. This unparliamentary, extra-parliamentary, and anti-parliamentary demonstration was triggered by what Marx called measures of religious coercion, proposed in Parliament and aimed at the tasks and pleasures of working-class daily life. Not only had the hours of places of public amusement been restricted, but the Sunday trading bill was directed against the working class, which receives its wages late on Saturdays and are thus the only section of the population forced to make their small purchases on Sundays. The demonstration was planned as a spectacle. Next slide, please. Wall posters invited artisans, workers, and the lower orders generally to Hyde Park to see how religiously the aristocracy is observing the Sabbath. The reluctant actors, elegant gentlemen and ladies in high coaches and four with liveried servants, were enveloped by, quote, a babble of jeering, taunting, discordant ejaculations in which no language is as rich as English. From both sides of a dense avenue of people, about two-thirds workers and one-third members of the middle class, all with their wives and children. Next slide, please. The spectacle, Marx wrote, lasted for 3 hours. As it was an improvised concert, instruments were lacking. The chorus thus therefore had to use its own organs and was compelled to confine itself to vocal music. And what a diabolical concert it was. A cacophony of grunting, hissing, whistling, squeaking, snarling, growling, croaking, shrieking, groaning, rattling, howling, gnashing sounds. The demonstration was repeated the following Sunday. Next slide, please. As 150,000 people from all classes and all ages turned out. The crowd swelled to dimensions that were immensely large and astonishing even by London standards. People again lined both sides of the road, only this time the crowds were more closely packed and deeper. The people who did not, however, appear were the upper crust, who avoided the scene of action and by its absence recognized the sovereignty of the vox populi. This time, however, the police intervened, bloodying heads and making arrests. A friend who was with him later recalled that, quote, Marx, who could grow very excited on such occasions, came near to being collared by a policeman and dragged before a magistrate. If during the first demonstration, Marx wrote, next slide please, the ruling classes had shown their fashionable physiognomy, now they showed their political physiognomy. Last Sunday, the crowd was confronted with the working class in its individual form, the elegant ladies and gentlemen. This time it appeared as political power, the law, the truncheon. Marx adopted a hydraulic metaphor from the Chartist movement to name these events. Pressure from without. Next slide, please. By pressure from without, the Englishman understands great extra-parliamentary popular demonstrations, he explained to an Austrian audience, which naturally cannot be staged without the lively participation of the working class. And this notion of pressure from without recurs in his political writings over the next 2 decades, becoming part of his political theory. Next slide, please. Pressure from without, however, the demonstration form, does not exist alone in isolation. It's part of a circuit of political forms, a series of metamorphoses which make up the noisy sphere of the political spectacle. Marx's journalism, letters, and pamphlets testify to his fascination, indeed obsession, with this noisy sphere of political life. Elections and plebiscites, presidents and prime ministers, constitutions and parties, legislative acts and royal commission hearings, impeachments and suffrage reforms, as well as demonstrations and marches, banquets and barricades. Even the overthrow of a regime, a revolution, appears as merely one type of political metamorphosis, not necessarily privileged. The question then is not so much whether Marx was for or against demonstrations, even as he joined or witnessed them, but their place in what he calls the religion of popular life. For Marx does not reduce the political to the economic, as he has often been accused of, nor does he accept the autonomy of the political. Rather, he understands the political as a phantasmagoria, analogous to the phantasmagoria of the marketplace, one with its own dialectic of form and content. On the one hand, Marx explores the social content underlining those political forms, the relation between class fractions and their political representatives, elaborated not only in the 18th Brumaire, but in this account of the Hyde Park demonstrations. Marx also saw a larger elective affinity between capitalist commerce and the forms of representative government. Next slide, please. The abstraction of the political state is a modern product, he argued. The participation of civil society in the political state through deputies, through representatives, is precisely the expression of their separation and merely dualistic unity. And the modern state was indeed wrought after the plan of a systematic and hierarchic division of labor, with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judicature. But Marx also asked the question of why this content takes these political forms, how to explain what he calls the state mysteries, the peculiar inverted phantasmagoria of politics. Though Etienne Balibar once distinguished between Marx's theory of fetishism arising from the market and his theory of ideology arising from the state, I would suggest that Marx had a specific theory of the forms of political fetishism, alongside the wage form, one might say, the vote form, alongside the commodity form, the constitution form. Next slide, please. The political constitution, he writes in his early critique of Hegel's theory of constitutional government, was until now the religious sphere, the religion of popular life, the heaven of its universality in opposition to the earthly existence of its actuality. Political life is, in the modern sense, is the scholasticism of popular life. And monarchy is the fullest expression of this estrangement, living under a monarchy at that time. In a passage that foreshadows the famous line in Capital, that capital seems to produce interest the way pear trees produce pear, he writes, "In this system, nature immediately creates kings, peers, etc., just as it creates eyes and noses." This notion of politics as a religion of popular life is, I think, the heart of Marx's political theory, the analog of his account of the way the fetishism of commodities and the mystery of wages constitute a religion of everyday life in capitalist production relations. In this religion of popular life lies, quote, the whole sham of state mysteries and state pretensions, a political phantasmagoria which includes, next slide please, the Constitution, the National Assembly, the dynastic parties, the blue and the red Republicans, the heroes of Africa, which is to say the imperial soldiers, the thunder from the platform, the sheet lightning of the daily press, the political names and the intellectual reputations, the civil law and the penal code, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Elections, which Marx often referred to as demonstrations, are central to this phantasmagoria. Election time in a country, the US, which is the archetype of democratic humbug, is, he wrote, full of hazards that may quite unexpectedly defy the logic of events. Nevertheless, this religion of popular life is not simply a democratic humbug, a mystifying illusion. It is also an objective form of life, in which, to paraphrase a famous line from Capital, it is natural for the actual agents of politics to feel completely at home in these estranged and irrational forms, since these are precisely the forms of illusion in which they move about in and find their daily occupation. Thus, Marx takes political forms as seriously as he does the forms of capital and labor. Thus, he analyzes voting through the analogy of wage labor. Next slide, please. The Paris communes, municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable in short terms, would serve the people as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for the workmen and managers in his business. If the vote form, like the wage form, was the basis for ideologies of freedom, equality, and justice in the representative state, as in the capitalist marketplace, the struggle over votes and elections was as important as the struggle over wages and strikes. Following Bernard Manin, next slide please, it's common to see three moments in the history of representative government. A shift from a parliamentary form to a party form to a new form which now wears several names. Manin called it audience democracy, others call it plebiscite democracy following Weber, or spectacle democracy, dominated not by the voice of the people, but next slide please, the eyes of the people, in Geoffrey Green's defense of the citizen spectator. Each of these concepts have attempted to theorize the emergence of a new post-party, post-democratic form of representative government, marked by the strange and contradictory union of mass demonstrations and authoritarian presidents that make up the contemporary spectacle of T.J. Clarke's brief guide, Our Own Religion of Popular Life. But perhaps our demonstration democracy is less a new populist spectacle than a moment in the circuit of political metamorphoses, first glimpsed in those demonstrations in Hyde Park and in the fusion of extended suffrage and presidential regimes in the age of Bismarck and Bonaparte, Disraeli and Lincoln. And now Damanpreet will take us to the specter of the Boz and the spectacle of political assassination in the post-colonial subcontinent.
Thanks, Michael. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated on October 31st, 1984, several months after she ordered a military attack on Amritsar's Golden Temple. Slide, please. I should have done this earlier, that's okay, where members of the Sikh militant movement that had emerged in the post-colonial period were seeking refuge. Next slide, please. Operation Blue Star, or the Battle of Amritsar among Sikhs, resulted in the elimination of Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, one of the leaders of the insurgency, and the deaths of many of his associates and other Sikhs who were visiting the Golden Temple complex. That Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated a few months after executing the hugely controversial and unpopular military operation by two of her Sikh security guards seemed to make the resulting investigation relatively clear. Beyant and Satwant Singh, the assassins, next slide please, pictured here with an alleged co-conspirator, were radicalized after Operation Blue Star and conspired to assassinate her in an act of revenge. In the trial, much was made of the appearance of a Boz, variously translated as a falcon, eagle, or hawk, at the Prime Minister's residence about a month before the assassination. The Boz was historically associated with the 10th Guru of the Sikh tradition, Gobind Singh. Next slide, please. Here he is depicted with his Boz. And a witness testified that when Beyant and Satwant Singh saw it, they offered to it an ardas, or a supplicatory prayer. The assassin's apparent reverence to the Boz suggested to the prosecution in the trial that its appearance set in train the conspiracy. The defense countered. Though the accused did view the Boz and seemed to offer it in ardas, their response to its appearance was only an apolitical expression of piety, well within their rights as Indian citizens, and not a declaration of intent to assassinate the Indian premier. Next slide, please. Attorneys on both sides remained confined within the interpretive limits of a liberal Indian secularism by arguing about whether the assassins had transgressed its boundaries. But we need not do the same. The appearance of the Boz, after all, was not only spiritually significant, but it also indexed the historical memory of a lost Sikh sovereignty, which was suppressed by the annexation of the Punjab by the British in 1849. The insurgency in the 1980s was seeking to rewrite what sovereignty might look like for the Sikhs in the now post-colonial period. The insurgents claimed that full freedom had not been attained even with the end of colonialism. For the Punjab, formal independence from British rule also meant its partition between India and Pakistan. While many of Punjab's Muslims migrated to the new Pakistan, Punjab Sikhs were integrated into the new India as a religious minority. Next slide, please. The insurgency grew in response to Indira Gandhi's rise to power. The successor to and daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, Mrs. Gandhi became increasingly authoritarian during her attempts to capture and retain political power over the course of 15 years of off and on premiership, steadily heightening the contradictions between center and regions. Mrs. Gandhi did battle not only with dissent from Punjab, but with various agitations from across India, articulated along lines of linguistic difference, economic rights, or religious or cultural autonomy. In response to the spectacle of Indira Gandhi's populist politics, most famously represented by her imposition of a national state of emergency, these dissident movements from the peripheries represented a counter-spectacle, often adopting violent tactics to challenge the excesses of her government. Next slide, please. Reflecting on the 1979 revolution in Iran, Michel Foucault observed that revolt is the mode through which, quote, subjectivity, not that of great men, but that of anyone, is brought into history, breathing life into it. Foucault's extended remarks on the Iranian Revolution, published in a series of articles, interviews, and essays, were often the subject of critique and even ridicule from his interlocutors. Where Foucault saw the expression of a serious kind of revolt by the Iranian people, what he would call the enactment of a political spirituality, his interlocutors saw a dangerous Islamic fanaticism that portended a dangerous Islamic fascism. Where Foucault saw the expression of that elusive category from political thought that seemed to him to be until then entirely theoretical, the collective will, his critics perceived the regressive forces of religion. Foucault's writings on Iran have been the subject of much critical attention, most thoroughly dealt with in Behrooz Gamari Tabrizi's Foucault in Iran. It's useful for me to think with Foucault to make sense of the Punjab insurgency, which, though it was violently suppressed by the Indian state by the early 1990s, was often compared to the nearly contemporaneous situation in Iran. Both within and outside of India, the comparisons were close at hand. Journalists were quick to point out that Bhindranwale, next slide please, who, recall, the Indian army had eliminated in June 1984, bore something of a physical resemblance to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Many extended the visual comparison to argue that Bhindranwale, like Khomeini, represented the threat of a religious fundamentalism that would endanger the integrity of the secular project that was so central to post-colonial India's self-definition on the world stage. The prolific and famously moderate Sikh columnist Khushwant Singh declared, quote, what the Ayatollah has succeeded in doing to Iranian Muslims, Bhindranwale has succeeded in doing to the Sikhs. Next slide, please. Beyond India, journalists invoked the image of revolutionary Iran and its Shia leadership to make insurgent Punjab legible to their readers. For example, in the Washington Post, it was reported that Bhindranwale was reminiscent of Khomeini as he recounted a litany of alleged atrocities against Sikh martyrs. In the Wall Street Journal, Bhindranwale was described as a Khomeini-style Sikh. In the Christian Science Monitor, they were described as possessing the same charisma, the same fiery fundamentalism in religion, and implacable political views. Commentators made facile comparisons between revolutionary Iran and insurgent Punjab, which fundamentally miscast Bhindranwale's role in the insurgency. Unlike Khomeini, Bhindranwale did not hold a formal position within a clerical hierarchy. He did not produce texts on matters of theology and practice. Next slide, please. Foucault offers an alternative way to read the similarities between Iran and Punjab. His observations of Iran enable a reading of the insurgency in general and the assassination in particular, not only as a counter-spectacle in response to the spectacle of state violence, but also as the expression of a political spirituality or a consent to martyrdom. Through Foucault, I can read insurgency era Punjab alongside revolutionary Iran, both popular Cold War era revolts expressed in the idiom of religion, read by the liberal mainstream as fanatical terrorism. Foucault did not read the situation in Iran through received scripts of intelligibility that would categorize popular revolt as either laudably left-wing or as right-wing reaction. Instead, he described himself as encountering the collective will of the people which happened to be expressed through a revolutionary Shia Islam, which in Foucault's estimation actually had little to do with Khomeini and his thought, but much to do with Islam as offering an opening for imagining a future utopia. He wrote that Shia Islam in Iran seemed to transform thousands of forms of discontent, hatred, misery, and despair into a force, serving as a form of expression, a mode of social relations, a supple and widely accepted elemental organization, a way of being together, a way of speaking and listening, something that allows one to be listened to by others and to yearn for something at the same time as they yearn for it. Foucault read Shia Islam as a form of political spirituality through which the revolutionary subject enacts revolution as a dialectic between hope for a future utopia and a present discipline. Foucault persuasively argued that this dialectic of hope and discipline enables ordinary Iranians to become martyrs for the sake of revolution. Next slide, please. It was a Foucauldian political spirituality that seemed to motivate Beant Singh to decide finally to assassinate Mrs. Gandhi. In an interview published in the November 1989 issue of Begum magazine, whose cover is pictured here, Beant Singh's widow Bimal Kaur, next slide, who had a political career after his death until her own mysterious premature death, which was likely an assassination, recalled when Beant Singh came home from work one day and told her about viewing the vase at the Prime Minister's residence. He told her that the vase had stayed there for 2 hours. Quote, all the security guards bowed to him. Then we tried to scare him away by starting our scooters, but he did not fly away. Bimal Kaur was surprised to hear about the vase's visit from Beant, as he hadn't given much purchase to things like this before. The sighting of the vase was one incident among many in the months leading up to the assassination that struck her as both new and, in retrospect, an indication of his increasing willingness to become a martyr, shaheed in the Punjabi from the Arabic. He told her that he would become a martyr as early as July, soon after the army invasion of the Golden Temple. In the months between June and October, he had stopped drinking, he began to regularly visit the Gurdwara, and was formally initiated as a Sikh in the Khalsa. In the weeks immediately preceding the assassination, he ate less than usual, she recalled, and began to give away his expensive possessions. While the prosecutors pointed to these changes as evidence of his descent into fanaticism, Bimal Kaur remembered them as evidence of his consent to martyrdom. On the night before the assassination, he told her that he planned to visit the Gurdwara before his morning shift began. She found this to be odd. I said, she recalled, but tomorrow you're going to the Gurdwara in the evening. You have a morning shift. He told her that there was a particular reason for the morning visit the next day, but she did not press him further that night. Everyone agreed that the Gurdwara was a central site that led to Beant Singh's decision to assassinate Mrs. Gandhi. Next slide, please. The journalist Shekhar Gupta argued that the question of conspiracy was actually secondary to Beant Singh's spiritual transformation, which was facilitated indeed by frequent visits to a significant Gurdwara in Delhi, Bangla Sahib. Bangla Sahib, Gupta wrote, quote, was not short of priests who read out the scriptures to describe in glowing detail how Sikhs had avenged all the attacks on the Golden Temple in their history, end quote. From Bangla Sahib, Beant Singh emerged ready to become an assassin, not as a cold-blooded mercenary, but as an irrational fanatic. Observers like Gupta cast the Gurdwara as an ideological breeding ground of a fanatical brand of Sikhism. Bimal Kaur's characterization of Beant as preparing for martyrdom may not appear to be out of step with the kind of picture Gupta paints. But in the hands of a journalist like Gupta, the discursive frame of religion casts a pall of irrationality over everything. Foucault, as an observer of the material force of religion, noticed how religion could function as a crucial revolutionary force when it is the available political lexicon. For Bimal Kaur, the visits to the Gurdwara, the willingness to become a martyr, the viewing of the vase, all indicated Beyond Thing's readiness to produce history, as Foucault described of revolutionary Iranians, in awareness of his own function in the ongoing struggle between the insurgency and the center in Delhi. Next slide, please. Foucault repeatedly noted that ordinary Iranians, those who articulated the collective will whose expression he was chasing in his writings, had little to say about what a post-revolution Iran would look like. So he too, as an observer, was not tasked with describing the contours of a post-revolution Islamic government. In Punjab too, the specifics of what would come remained up for debate, even by the time Bimolkor was interviewed in 1989. Different tendencies of the movement advanced varying ideas about an autonomous Punjab, ranging from an ethno-nationalist state to a province within the umbrella of the Indian nation state. In the interview, Bimolkor did not endorse a specific vision for the future of Punjab, but she suggested that it would have to borrow from the historical memory of the past to reinvent itself in the present. Quote, whether in Punjab there's Khalistan, she said, using the then contemporary name for would-be autonomous Punjab, Khalsa Raj, which predated the colonial encounter, or self-representation in a confederal structure within a broader Indian state, according to Sikh principles, everyone ought to have equal rights. This kind of free Punjab, in her estimation, was antithetical to the existing Indian state, which she characterized as a form of Brahminical rule, colonialism in a new guise. Next slide, please. But amid the heat of the insurgency, only hope and discipline, struggle and martyrdom were certain. All that was real was the specter of the Baz, which pierced through the spectacle of Mrs. Gandhi's authoritarianism and even the counter-spectacle of her death. While the grounds of politics were stable, the Baz was aloft, somewhere in the skies between past and future. Next, Henry will offer a reading of the transition from liberal optimism to apathetic spectatorship in China.
Thanks, Dompreet. In 1979, He Chongyin, the chief editor of the Chinese Journal of Nature, declared the program of researching image recognition through non-visual organs, slide please, uncovering the mechanisms in the human body for, quote, receiving, transmitting, processing, and displaying information. Soon after, the Chinese physicist and cyberneticist Qian Xuesen speculated that, as media theorist Xiao Liu documents, such recognition came from a real-time connection of the human body to waveform-based information technology. In Qian's own words, every human being is a sender of electromagnetic waves, and everyone a receiver too. Qian claims Liu was emblematic for the scramble by Chinese intellectuals to find a kind of depoliticized, technocratic vision of the future to fill the semi-vacuum left by the end of revolution. Mao had died in 1976, the Cultural Revolution had been condemned as an ultra-leftist mistake, and China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, launched a series of sweeping political and economic reforms that, while resembling glasnost and perestroika, were more gradualist. Rather than overnight price and trade liberalization, privatization, and austerity, China maintained a dual-track economy with price controls on essential goods, while liberalizing non-essential goods. Of course, most people knew that where Yeltsin prevailed, standing on a tank to applause, the nameless Chinese tank man failed. The party hardliners won the battle for the country's future, deepening economic liberalization, but halting political reform. Slide, please. In the 80s, however, quote, the imaginary of the waves thus lent form to the confused historical visions at a moment when the socialist past was abruptly denied and drained of meaning, whereas the burgeoning consumer desires stimulated by Deng's marketization were constantly called into conflicts and negotiations with the ideology and political claims of a party that still retained the name communism. For Qian in particular, what needed to replace communism, which was not dead, but merely relegated to a kind of transcendent sphere like that of the deist god, was somatic science. That, namely, research into the paranormal capabilities of the human body might find a way for this body to receive these electromagnetic waves. He seized on the ready-made Chinese health practice to provide this kind of receptive medium. Qigong. Qigong is a type of traditional health practice in China which focuses on harnessing qi, or breath, as the practitioner performs a series of movements. It might be fair to say that Qigong has roots in a much older, ancient Chinese cosmology. Alongside many other tenets in traditional Chinese medicine, the routes of qi through the body are mentioned as early as the Yellow Emperor's Internal Classic of Medicine, compiled in the Han Dynasty, about 300 BC. But in its current iteration, as David Palmer's study of the practice argues, Qigong is a fairly young practice, quote, launched from within socialist state institutions in the 1950s before becoming the carrier of urban China's most popular form of religious expression in the 1980s, and later a powerful and enduring challenge to the legitimacy of China's political leadership in the late 1990s. Slide, please. Why challenge? In China's 80s, universities and research institutes were involved in such research with the blessing of the party, Qigong research with the blessing of the party, many of whose high-level party officials were also involved in the practice. For Tian, indeed, Qigong was seen as a kind of new syncretic science that would ultimately revitalize Marxism and was not, in fact, opposed to it. Tian actually rewrote the first line of the Communist Manifesto in one of his tracts by saying that it was a specter of, quote, somatic science that was haunting China. However, by the 90s, the practice had begun to arouse the party's suspicion, its political power becoming more and more obvious and threatening. In particular, Falun Gong, one offshoot of Qigong, whose followers eventually took to Tiananmen Square in April 1999 to stage the largest demonstration since the student uprising a decade prior, demanding the release of imprisoned fellow practitioners, resulted in another crackdown and their imprisonment or exile. Of course, Qigong's potential use as a, quote, mechanism of more direct communication between the human body and the information environment also links it to the new communication technology, television, which was introduced and popularized in the country in the 80s. In 1983, the central government allowed local governments to start their own television broadcasts. That same year, the Spring Festival Gala, hosted by the China Central Television Station, began its uninterrupted run, it's still running, as the most popular show across the nation. Broadcast as well from these televisions were less popular Hollywood films. Slide, please. The television as one receiver and the human body as another. The point was brought home acutely in one dramatic episode in the conflict between the Falun Gong and the Chinese media. In 2002, when a cable TV network in Changchun, the northeastern Chinese city where Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Gong, was born, was hacked by some rogue practitioners and made to broadcast videos glorifying Falun Gong and videos denouncing the state violence against practitioners. Indeed, the human body as a receiver for cosmic information is something that Ma Jian's novel, which I talk about now, which is called Beijing Coma, explores. Beijing Coma is about the story of Dai Wei, a member of the informal student-run security corps during the student protests in and beyond Beijing in 1989, who is tasked with keeping his fellow students and protesters safe, but who was shot in the head during the military crackdown in the night of June 4th and morning of June 5th, and spends the next 11 years in a coma, forced not only to relive his memories leading up to this moment, but also to observe his body as a square with no escape routes, as the country enters into deepening reforms in the 90s. Slide, please. Dai Wei is the son of a convicted anti-revolutionary and grows up resenting his father for staining their family's reputation and preventing him from receiving a cushy job in the army. Eventually, however, he ends up following in his father's footsteps, dropping out of school towards the beginning of the economic reform period, becoming a street peddler of cheap southern goods that have been smuggled over the border from Hong Kong to sell on the black market for a high markup. But by 1984, the market has grown much larger. Pornographic films are being shown in video rooms on every street corner. The influx of new media is contraband. Liu, in her book, also talks about how Chinese citizens set up illegal fishbone-shaped antenna on their rooftops to capture TV broadcasts from Hong Kong. These goods and media, of course, were ultimately from the West, and alongside them came the sweet bullets, quote unquote, of what just 10 years ago would have been denounced as spiritual pollution. The saccharine pop music of the Taiwanese pop artist Deng Lijun, and a certain flattened form of liberalism that college students took up during the demonstrations in 1987 and then 1989. As he lies comatose, Dai Wei becomes a kind of travesty of the body as receptor for various waveform transmissions that Qian and others had hoped to hail. He is forced to lie on his bed 24 hours a day and listen as his mother turns on the radio or watches the Spring Festival Gala on her new television. However, this perfect receptivity comes at the cost of his autonomy. Rather than a kind of limitless upgrading of his consciousness, a kind of utopianism that much Chinese fiction in the 80s echoes, Dai Wei's situation is akin to that of a surgery patient whose anesthesia has stopped working, but is still immobilized. He is forced to listen to the entirety of his country's hurtling towards liberalization, its economic cruelty forcing his mother to sell his kidney to pay rent, and eventually results in the apartment he is lying in being demolished as he is still comatose. When these are not, when the television and radio are not playing, he thinks, quote, "The silence is a torment because it forces me to recognize that I am lying motionless on an iron bed." Indeed, Ma's point seems very much to be that without a kind of will, the technological revolution longed for by Tian will result in exactly the same kind of contemplative subject that Lukács mentions as a product of late capitalism, confronting society and oneself as a kind of still life, viewing it as a second unchangeable nature, to be pondered but not remade. Liu ends her study in the end of the 80s, after which the conventional wisdom is that the country's populace sank into a kind of political quiescence, that those who stayed in China quickly redirected their energy into achieving personal freedom through economic prosperity, and that those who engaged in politics did so only through the party, but never popular movements. Qigong confederations like the Falun Gong, then, in this reading, would necessarily be peddlers and sufferers of false consciousness, a doubly degraded kind of retreat into the metaphysical for a people who had been demobilized twice. First, away from the mass action, however destructive, under Maoism, and secondly, away from even liberal democracy, however much a capitulation to world capitalism that might have been. Slide, please. Still, the novel does not end with quite this kind of pessimism. In fact, Qigong is depicted as a progressive social force in the novel. When Dai Wei is in the first few years of his coma, his mother, after exhausting all conventional biomedical methods to wake him up, nearly going bankrupt in the process, eventually takes him to a Qigong practitioner, who is one of the few people able to briefly rouse his body from the coma. Quote, "He presses my soft wound again, transmitting a warm glow into my brain. He sees the practitioner through a ball of white light. The latter says, 'You must imagine yourself as me. Only then will I be able to stimulate the subtle channels of your body and let my energy resonate at the same frequency as yours.'" Dai Wei then mentions that he, quote, "remembers reading an article on thought transmission a few years ago, but I'd never experienced the phenomenon before. My memories began to swirl. His electromagnetic waves seep through my brain like wine." The nurse who attends to him adds that doctors are the broadcasting stations and the patients are the radios. If the radios aren't turned on, they won't receive the broadcasts. Though the Qigong practitioner ultimately fails to wake Dai Wei up, thinking that he was unable to detect the signal. Because the institute that his mother takes him to is too expensive, eventually Dai Wei's mother asks a practitioner of Falun Gong named Master Yao to come help out. He does so free of charge. In the process, she herself begins learning the practice. Later, she says, I bought an instruction tape and have been practicing the meditation exercises with some other women in the compound. It's had a miraculous effect. I hadn't realized how many little ailments I've developed over the years. Headaches, chest pain, backache, arthritis. They all seem to have disappeared since I've done the exercises. Ma purposefully links Falun Gong to the student protests 10 years prior. In fact, it is thanks to Falun Gong that, for the only time in the book, Dai Wei's mother, who opposes every single anti-government act that her husband and son have thus far taken, finally loses her cool and verbally assaults a police officer. She shouts, "You can knock me to the ground, but I will crawl back up again, and the Falun wheel will still be spinning inside me. Arrest me if you want. I don't care. What difference will it make? China is one huge prison. Whether we're in jail or in our homes, every one of us is a prisoner." Dai Wei, lying a few feet away, is surprised. He thinks, 6 weeks ago, she stood outside the Zhongnanhai government compound with 10,000 fellow practitioners for 6 hours and returned a different person. She probably feels just like we did at the beginning of the student movement. When people become part of a group, they find a courage they never knew they possessed before. Of course, things end badly for her. She is beaten up by the police and eventually released because of her frailty, but Master Yao, with whom she has fallen in love, is sent to jail alongside most of the other protesters. This version of the 18th Brumaire, however, first in 1989 and then in 1999, is not the end of the novel, but is given a coda. Dai Wei finally wakes up on the new year in 2000 to the ruins of his house and a missing mother. He has finally regained his will and agency and mobility, presumably now that the country has gone through its version of shock therapy, but is much diminished and isolated from any collectivity. He wonders, once you've climbed out of this fleshy tomb, where is there left for you to go? Okay, that's my presentation. And next, I'll let Madeline talk about her presentation on Tonducheng's history as a U.S. military camp town, its future as a tourist site, and the forms of care that camp town women provide and receive.
The landscape turns from gray to green as we veer off the freeway. Che Xin, our tour guide, points to the U.S. military territories lining either side of the road, revealing that over 40% of the city's land was once entirely occupied by the U.S. military. Next slide. We arrive at our destination, a parking lot at the base of Soyosan Mountain in the city of Dongducheon, located in Gyeonggi Province in the northern part of South Korea. At the edge of the parking lot are two structures made of wooden beams, plastic tarp, and rope, plastered with colorful signage. Behind them is a fence topped with barbed wire. Next slide. One of the several paintings fastened to the encampment's exterior depicts the terrain cordoned off by the fence, tall trees shading a stark white two-story building. A nearby banner declares the camp's purpose. The medical detention center is protected by peace. It is possible to live off of peace, end quote. Today marks the 299th day of the Soyosan encampment by Northern Gyeonggi Province Citizens Peace Action, a civic organization based in Dongducheon that I will hereafter refer to as Peace Action. The encampment marks the latest struggle in Dongducheon's Cold War history as South Korea's most infamous Kijicheon, a Korean term for a military camp town, which is a phrase referring to business districts that emerge around U.S. military bases, catering to the soldiering clientele. Next slide, please. Entertainment and service industries staffed by Korean women and frequented by American servicemen constitute the lifeblood of camp towns, as have their attendant racialized sexual economies. Having existed since the outbreak of the Korean War, camp towns reached their heyday in the 1960s and 1970s, when prostitution industries emerged in response to U.S. soldiers' demands for sexual labor. As Dongducheon came to teem with bars and clubs, U.S. officials began to fret over the spread of venereal disease among their ranks, shirking their failure to enforce safer sex practices among soldiers onto Korean women, and collaborating with Korean officials to implement new regimes of policing, incarceration, and surveillance for managing women's bodies. These practices culminated in the widespread creation of so-called monkey houses, a colloquial term for medical detention facilities where police and medical personnel forcibly detained and treated Korean women accused of having STDs. Next slide. The white building depicted in the painting on the outside of the Peace Action encampment is the Nakomja STD Management Center, the last standing monkey house building in the country, located just a few feet behind the tents. In February 2023, the Dongducheon city government announced intent to raze down the center, which fell into disuse in the 1990s. After the city's mayor refused multiple requests to dialogue with residents who opposed the demolition, Peace Action launched their encampment last year as part of a nationwide campaign to reverse the city's decision. As a Dongducheon-based civil society group dedicated to, quote, raising regional consciousness about peace and human rights, end quote, according to the mission statement, Peace Action organizers instead hope to repurpose the building as a peace museum that addresses the militarized violence that transpired at the site. Next slide. As the center's destruction remains contested, the struggle to protect the Nakomja Center raises key questions about the relationship between space and memory. The city intends to erect a hotel and a hot spring in the center's place, but organizers have moved with immense speed to raise awareness about the building, garnering the attention of international press, pushing a petition with thousands of supportive signatures to the government, and mobilizing the UN Human Rights Council special rapporteurs to deliver a letter to the national government urging for a stop to the center's demolition. As a result, the Dongducheon government agreed to talks with organizers, which began this past January, but the city has yet to finalize a decision about the demolition. With the fate of the Nakomja Center and of the Soyosan encampment hanging in tandem, in my part of our presentation, I ask, what is the relationship between camp, camptown, and the protest encampment? Forms of spatial occupation that share an etymology and, in the case of Dongducheon, a landscape. How has Dongducheon's history as a U.S. military camptown become the grounds for emergent forms of memory work? And how do the encampment and its demands perform a particular kind of remembrance, one that demands not just metaphorical, but material coexistence with the past? Next slide. To examine the relationship between the military camptown and the protest encampment, we might begin with their shared etymology. Nongsongjang, the Korean word for encampment, itself has military origins, deriving from the Hanja or Chinese characters for rong, meaning to cage or to shackle, and for sung, meaning castle. Together, rongsong means to defend in a fort, to garrison, or more colloquially, to stay in one's room for a period of time. David Vine has traced the origins of the modern U.S. military base back to the spatial forms of the colonial trading post, the fort, and the imperial camp, noting how the ancient Romans constructed camps across their empire, both temporary and permanent, respectively called Caesar's camps and Castra Sativas. Beyond the military base, armed conquest has historically produced an array of camps for containing and managing displaced populations. Consider the prisoner of war camp, the concentration camp, the refugee camp. And Giorgio Agamben famously defined the camp as, quote, the space that is open when the state of exception begins to become the rule and gains a permanent spatial form, end quote, where the inmate is reduced to, quote, bare life, end quote. Next slide. In host nations, military camps have given way to military camptowns. In South Korea, military camptowns bear the traces of the multiple foreign occupations that have conditioned Korea's Cold War modernity. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the U.S. military reoccupied Korea, reappropriating land first seized by the Japanese Imperial Army as U.S. military base territory. As camptowns emerged across the peninsula, Dongducheon became the most active among them, with over 7,000 women to have been recorded to have worked in the local sex industry at its peak. Dongducheon was also the wealthiest, with sexual services playing a key role in raking in American dollars for the national post-war economy. So much so that in the 1960s, some Koreans referred to Dongducheon as Donducheon, don meaning money. So on the slide, you can see a photo of the main strip of bars and clubs in downtown Dongducheon in the 1990s. Popular Cold War media depictions cast camptowns as rampant with racial unrest between Black and white U.S. soldiers and Korean women, as districts rife with vice from drink to drugs, and most notably for this presentation, as hotbeds of venereal disease. In Korean, women in the camptown sex industries were called yanggongju, a derogatory term meaning Yankee princess, and faced extreme social alienation due to their affiliation with the sex industry. The stigmatization formed the grounds on which the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee that rose to power in 1963 through a military coup could establish a program of monkey houses. Fearing the United States' intent to pull troops and aid from South Korea under the Nixon Doctrine, Park's administration sought to use monkey houses to clean up camptowns' negative reputations, rendering Korean women's bodies the terrain on which ROK U.S. diplomacy would play out. Next slide. The Yanggongju, once marginalized, found herself plunged into the national limelight when a Camptown sex worker, Yoon was brutally assaulted and murdered in Dongducheon by American GI Kenneth Markle in the fall of 1992. As photographs of Yoon's mutilated body circulated in the press, the murder's hypervisibility marked a shift in the Yanggongju's social status, as Grace M. Cho has put it, from that of a shameful sex worker in exile to the nation's daughter welcomed home. The spectacle of Yoon's body sparked a nationwide movement against U.S. military occupation, though feminist critics have pointed out that some commentary continues to problematically identify Yoon's body with the South Korean national body raped by U.S. military occupation. On the slide is a photo of the candlelight memorial Dongducheon activists hold for Yoon every year on the date of her murder. And normally it's held near the murder site, but since the encampment, they've moved the memorial to Soyosan. Chae Shin, the activist and tour guide with whom I opened this paper, has underscored that a lasting consequence of the sensationalization has been Dongducheon's remembrance as the crime site rather than as the heart of a nationwide movement for Korean sovereignty. If you could press the space bar, that would be great. Chae, who grew up in Dongducheon, noted that Yoon's murder marked a turning point in her own path to becoming an organizer. Radicalized as a college student in Seoul by the mass movement for democracy sweeping the nation in the 1980s, as an adult, Chae moved back to Dongducheon, where she was jolted to action by Yoon's death. Having joined forces with fellow residents demanding justice, in an interview, Chae reflected, "But there's a trade-off that happens here. If this is all that is repeatedly shown about Dongducheon in the media and on TV, Dongducheon becomes a city that is known only for this." The task of honoring Dongducheon's place in the national and global movement against U.S. militarism has been central to Chae's work. Noting a dearth of civil society spaces in the city, Chae and her comrades co-founded Peace Action in 2017, aiming to foster and mobilize a regional network around matters of war and militarism, democracy, and peace as they pertain to northern Gyeonggi province, where Dongducheon is located. Next slide. After all, the 1953 ceasefire brokered from without did not end the Korean War, but rather rendered war a prolonged condition of everyday life. Host to over 70 recorded U.S. military installations, South Korea ranks only after Japan and the Philippines among countries with the highest numbers of overseas U.S. military installations. Since the 1990s, changes in military policy have produced the partial return of U.S.-based territories to the South Korean national government and an attendant reduction of U.S. troops in cities like Dongducheon. These changes have left city blocks of shuttered bars, restaurants, and shops, though Dongducheon is still host to over 2,000 U.S. troops and several military bases that occupy the city center, one of which is pictured on the right side of the slide. There are different ways to narrate these changes. One can naturalize the troop reduction as the organic consequence of over 5 decades of ceasefire, or cite the decisions of elected policymakers. Yet Chae Shin has refused to allow such narratives to overshadow the fact that the city's residents have long contested the conditions of their military occupation. In other words, the question of what to do with the empty buildings, facilities, and ruins that base returns and troop reductions leave behind is also a question of how and who gets to determine what such places and spaces ultimately mean. Next slide. In addition to organizing with Peace Action, in 2015, Chae began working, informally at first, as an independent tour guide in Dongducheon. Today, she offers tours of the city, charting its militarized history to activists, educators, and students. So on the slide are photos from several of her tours. More recently, Chae has added the Soyosan encampment as the final destination. As a guide, Chae emphasizes that the encampment is not a break in Dongducheon's subjection to militarized violence, but rather a manifestation of the resistance spirit historically carried forth by Dongducheon people. Quote, "Of course, Camptown women were victimized by military and state-sponsored violence. But when people come here to the encampment, we also want to show them that these women have always worked to protect themselves and each other. The people of Dongducheon have always protected each other," end quote. Next slide. Accounts of camps have extensively charted how they operate as sites that enact state-sponsored violence, but less has been made of a different kind of camp, one constructed not to secure the sovereign power of the state, but instead to challenge it. Encampments are not static nodes of social disruption, but dynamic sites of contestation. The protest camp is not a state of exception, but capable of shaking up its own social and political context. This dynamism also manifests within encampments, which are social worlds unto themselves, approaching what Joshua Clover has illuminated about the commune, as campers negotiate collective agreements and norms of engagement. Campers at Soyosan span age groups, positionalities, and organizational affiliations. In addition to peace action organizers, members of labor unions, sex worker advocacy groups, and progressive political parties, among others, take shifts manning the Soyosan encampment. Though temporary by definition, encampments also often become long-standing, evolving into places where people work, eat, sleep, and socialize. Next slide, please. As their one-year anniversary approaches, the Soyosan encampment has become a pivotal fixture in the landscape of Dongducheon, operating as the eyes, ears, and mouth of the building that has been host and witness to decades of state violence. Organizers actively mediate between the city and the public, between the building and the surrounding environment, between past and future. During my visits, hikers and families passing by frequently stop to examine and inquire about the signs posted outside the tents. If the purpose of the fence erected by the city around the Nakomja Center is to keep people out, the encampment is an opening that invites people in. Organizers often refer to the building in conversations as an agent to which they hold themselves accountable. One of the encampment's main organizers, Kim Dae-yong, spoke of the Nakomja Center as one might speak of a comrade. Quote, "It's because of the building that we've been able to hold out this long," end quote. In a more humorous iteration, Choi Shin once joked to people present that, quote, "We're all the building's fans," end quote. Next slide. While it's possible to interpret such ways of speaking as pure metonymy in which the building operates as a stand-in for the women who are detained there or for the broader violence of militarism, like speaking of the Baz in Damanpreet's presentation, speaking of the building as an agent in its own protection is not simply rhetorical. In a conversation at the encampment, Che once spoke of the difference between 현실, reality, and 진실, the truth. She began by recalling how deeply affected she and the entire nation had been by the 2014 Sewol ferry sinking, an incident that killed over 300 passengers on board, many of whom were young students. Nationwide outrage at the negligence of safety precautions by boat operators and at justice deferred for victims' families galvanized the popular movement for then South Korean President Park Geun-hye's impeachment in 2016. Choi recalled attending the impeachment protests in Seoul every day, quote, "If Yoon Geum-hee's case made me see the reality of the world I was living in, then the Sewol ferry disaster made me see the truth within that reality. This clinging to this place, Dongducheon, it's like I'm trying to say, now let's look at the truth. It's not just about the things that happened, it's about the people, the women who came here and testified. Some of them say things like, how could we be injected with penicillin like that? It hurt so much, I couldn't even straighten my back." They say those things and you can feel the tears buried between the lines of what they say. That's the real truth. Not just that they were injected with penicillin or dragged here. The shame and pain they felt from being targeted all the time. That kind of sorrow and hardship. And I keep thinking that truth needs to be preserved, to remain somehow, end quote. If Hyunshil notes what's happened, then Jinshil asks the question of how and why and what must be done about it. In Che's account, truth-telling is not only an action, but an orientation to the world grounded in a practice of reading, sensing, and listening, from building facades to testimony, for what is made absent from the official record. Put differently, if the Nakomja Center building is a manifestation of and testament to the Hyunshil of militarized violence, then we might approach the Soyasan encampment as its twin vehicle for uncovering Jinshil, the truth. Thank you for listening to our reflections on Uncommon Question about spectacle and a dialectic which moves between the whole and the part. We now invite questions about each or any of the parts of our presentations or about the project as a whole.
I think we're a small enough group that people can just speak up if you have a question or comment. Just don't speak over each other.
Maybe I'll start. Sorry again about the noise. Um, but we opened with the TJ Clark account of spectacle, and what I love about that article is how seriously he takes the spectacle of Trump when so many, I think, liberals and leftists who are attacking Trump sort of see that spectacle as buffoonery or whatever. And so that got me thinking, like, how do we take the spectacle seriously as a technique and strategy? And we got some sort of inkling of that, in Madeline's presentation, um, and and of course in the society of spectacle that we're engaging with, so much of that is about based on the situationists and creating a spectacle. Although I think in Michael's presentation and the thinkers he's engaging with, like Bevins, are really critical of that. But yeah, I just would love to hear more from anyone about what you see as the role of the spectacle, I guess for the left. This is the Marxist education group. Yeah, thank you.
Well, no one. So that's a hard question. I think that we have wrestled with all year long in some sort of way, and maybe I'll and it addresses more of the ones today, I suppose. Uh, I guess I would end up thinking that. Um, and maybe people will disagree or whatever, that it's less clear whether one can come up with the notion of a counter spectacle or how useful that is. And I think that even in my thinking about demonstrations and Madeline ending with the encampment, with the sense of witness, with the sense that I think that there are alternative ways and concepts, perhaps, that emerged that become uh, responses by popular movements and social movements to the the commodity spectacle or the political spectacle, but it's less clear that there is a kind of counter spectacle that can easily be occupied by the left. It's not maybe one of the things I think I'm not sure any of us ever talked about, though it was part of our conversations, is that early on in the revolutionary tradition, coming right out of the French Revolution, was the idea of the festival as the kind of democratic alternative to this. And there are certainly moments in radical history when the festival and various forms of popular festival were seen as that. I'm not sure any of us exactly focused on the festival, and I'm not sure the way to which the festival stands as any kind of alternative in the present.
what I've got running through my mind right now is the dialectic between the spectacle and the spectators. And I mean, if we accept the notion of the spectacle as a phenomenon or an instrument or a manifestation of capitalist domination, then the spectators are reduced to those who are the dominated, and then the counter spectacle would become the movement of the oppressed and exploited, that in the first instance, a mass demonstration seeks to put the powers that be or the rulers into the position of spectators. You must listen to us. You must pay attention to us. You must attend to what we are presenting to you. So that might be the place to start in thinking about a counter spectacle.
Yeah, I think this is all making me rethink, because I think I might be the only person who uses counterspectacle today. And it seems to me that if spectacle relies on kind of entirely on image or something, there is something like the image of just the spectators watching the spectacle. The counter spectacle seems, what we're saying, to be insufficient to describe the kinds of responses that the spectacle necessitates for any kind of productive political project to emerge. Like, counter spectacle is always going to be insufficient. And I think I realize as we're having this discussion that that's kind of where the specter ends up in my thinking, where there's something lurking beneath the counter spectacle that isn't just the gunshot. And there is this entire kind of universe that's captured by the specter that actually kind of escapes the visual entirely. And I think that seems to be something that I think that was also kind of why we ended up at witness feeling like a richer way to think about the dialectical other of spectacle, because witness captures kind of, I think, a richer sense of not just response, but there's something else happening when one witnesses or testifies. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Another way to think of it, perhaps, is, and it comes up, I only threw it at I think in my very last slide, is that book, which is quite interesting, though I'm not sure I would recommend it highly to anyone. The Jeffrey Green one on the eyes of the people, where he essentially tries to make a virtue out of the problem and to say, actually, that democracy doesn't really require the voice of the people, that the eyes of the people are sufficient, and indeed uses the term a citizen spectator. We shouldn't be worried that citizens have been reduced to spectators. And there are moments when I feel like he's kind of over arguing for a situation where it seems as if democracy no longer exists to say this is democracy. On the other hand, I think the interest of this book is not if you see it as a kind of argument for what things ought to be, then actually a look at new political technologies that are out there and the sense that in some ways the technologies of opinion polling, of the various things that he sees, and that the ability to, what would be one of his example of kind of freedom of information acts or the access to government websites or whatever, that indeed, that even if a government doesn't act democratically and doesn't listen to the voice of the people, if it knows that it's being watched by citizens, that's actually part of the technology of representative government right now. And that, I think, is, insofar as it's a kind of political strategy, I don't find it terribly powerful, but as an account of the way in which the relation of citizens, spectators to states are, I think is actually a quite interesting contribution to this attempt. And I think perhaps I'll just end on that, is that one of the things that happens in this argument is that it rereads the transition from party representation to spectator representation to explain what many people, say Piketty on the left, have defined of de-alignment. That, oh, there used to be parties that were working class parties and actually represented the labor movement, and that something's wrong with these parties because people have been de-aligned with them. What I think is actually a more interesting argument is not the one that something happened to those parties and now we have to kind of reconstruct the party form, but that indeed that moment of party representation is a kind of historical moment in representative government which we are no longer in, and that as a result new forms, and in that sense both the authoritarian populist president and the huge number of mass demonstrations or encampments or occupations are a different sort of political world than the one that was there 50 years ago.
Do encampments arise as a means of circumventing the problem of the evanescence of mass demonstrations? I mean, the demonstration happens on one day and then it's over. You know, we had last weekend, 5-10 million people out doing things, and where are they? Where have they gone? So that the encampment arises as a means of prolonging and extending that contestation, perhaps.
Yeah, I think on that note and on this discussion about different kinds of political forms that emerge both like at the level of the state, but also more democratic political forms that emerge in resistance to these kinds of commodity or fascist spectacles. Yeah, I think in the case of the encampment, what's really compelling about the kind of prolonged spatial occupation is that then it becomes a kind of opportunity to be a kind of social political experiment where, for example, a lot of campers at the Soyosan encampment, which is approaching a full year, spend every day there, or at least part of their days there, or at least once a week for people who are coming through to kind of staff the different shifts. And that's a kind of repeated, not only active commitment, but a kind of ritual that is also turns into a way of life, not just a form of protest, but also an opportunity to negotiate new kinds of social norms and agreements among encampers, to take time to actually maintain and uphold the tent structures, because they're serving as shelter for everybody there. And I do feel that is a very different kind of political form that requires a kind of prolonged occupation of space, that the mass demonstration doesn't necessarily attempt, but maybe something like the commune does. Although I would also, the relationship to property is also very, I think, interesting to think about in relation to the commune or the encampment. But this conversation is making me think more about not only the distinctions between these forms, but also like how we might historicize them. So a history of the encampment might tell us something, I think, very different about spectacle or witness, I think, than a history of state spectacle. Yeah.
And I'll just add to that it is interesting now that we're getting into this conversation on encampments that they're like different forms of camp come up in different presentations. I mean, Madeline's is the clearest, but also Jess had a piece about sort of encampment outside of a stadium for Cuban exiles, and then the sort of, I think also Morgan, we got into it more when we were reading the materials for your presentation, but the sort of like process of creating encampments in the Arctic for exploration. And I think also my presentations that, well, I didn't include it as much in my presentation, but guerrilla camps in the sort of in the jungle, right? And the question also, I mean, what we saw with Madeline is a sort of like the encampment as a sort of semi-permanent contestation of space, but then there's also these the sort of like time and space become so important for different encampments, because then mobility is really kind of the key, right? To be able to pack your things up and move and set up camp somewhere else because you're being persecuted or something else. And I do think that there are connections that, you know, they're not resolved. And as Michael was saying, we didn't exhaustively discuss all of this, but to the spectacle, to the sort of, and in particular, the sort of visuality of it, and the specter, and the encampment, and that, and other sort of political forms similar to it, creating a new way, like new images that can counter either the spectacle, if not create a counter spectacle, or constitute one, but kind of create a spectrality that seems to always unsettle the logics of the spectacle, the sort of like clear foundations of that. And I think there's also that sort of, you know, those are different kind of moving things that I'm also coming from this project trying to kind of work out.
Are there further questions or comments? If not, we can thank the Yale Working Group on Globalization and Culture. I really appreciate your joining us for these two panels, and we look forward to seeing you next year around this time. Michael, any last thoughts or comments?
No, thank you very much for hearing us and responding to us. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.